Hey everyone, welcome to RotoCurve Live for Week 3, presented by Rosters.com. If you haven't signed up yet, be sure to go over to Rosters and use promo code CURVE for an instant $20 bonus on your initial deposit. Deposit $10, end up with 30, that's not a bad deal. I'm Josh Galacci, and I'm here as always with my co-hosts and beautiful faces, Adam Pfeiffer and Jim McCormick, as we are here to help you cash in Week 3 in NFL DFS. As what we'll do on RC Live here for week 3, we're going to go through our favorite players at each position, giving you an idea of who we are going to be targeting for our lineups. And of course, as always at RotoCurve Live, we're going to be giving you our bold calls at the end. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Week 3 in NFL DFS, quarterbacks, that's the building block. Adam, let's start with you. Who are you targeting this week?
Yeah, it's a little not confusing, but it's a little different because you have the whole Monday night situation on the sites, and then there's obviously two great guys in those games. But I'm gonna go with Andrew Luck here. Didn't perform well in Denver, which is kind of expected now. This is one of the best defenses we've seen in years, and I just think we're gonna get closer to what we saw in Week 1 in this matchup. Game's projected to be extremely high scoring, two relatively weak defenses, and like Andrew Luck is going to be a guy who's going to have a insane upside in decent matchups just because of their defense. The Colts defense is so bad. They've Indianapolis has trailed on 83% of their plays so far this season. Now, granted, it's only 2 weeks in, but like their defense is going to get torched by Philip Rivers and company, I think, which will put Luck in a situation to throw. Already has 87 pass attempts through 2 weeks, and dating back to the start of last season, he leads the NFL in pass attempts per game at around 43. I know Moncrief being out is a bit of a knock, but this is a very good matchup. We'll get into his weapons later, and I know we like some of his weapons a little bit, but I just think with a 27.5 implied team total, Chargers allowing 324 yards per game through the air so far this season, I don't see how Andrew Luck doesn't go for 300 and at least 2 touchdowns in this spot, especially if the Chargers can keep producing on offense and force Luck to throw.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Like you said, that high total, that is going to be a game a lot of people target. So, Jim, your top quarterback this week, if you could pick any of them, which one would it be?
Yeah, I mean, if we're gonna be playing any of the tournaments that include Monday, I'm just gonna go with the highest ceiling. I think we learned a lesson from Adam last week with Cam Newton. He was in the millionaire lineup for Al Zeidenfeld. So, I'm going with the guy with the highest floor and the highest ceiling, which is Drew Brees at home. I mean, I know we've seen Drew Brees struggle on the road before. We saw that last week with the Giants. Maybe some people will be a little bit, recency bias wise off of him. I think also the Monday thing might push people off if they're not going to want to wait for their quarterback points. But yeah, I mean, I just think a 37, 38 point ceiling on DraftKings, I mean, that's incredibly high. I think that's what we're talking about. He's averaged 22 points a game at home against Atlanta the last 2 years. So both of these teams, I mean, obviously we're talking about implied point totals. This is a 54 point, point projection for the game. So all the Vegas metrics are here. I don't think you have to sell Drew Brees too much.
Yeah, I agree with you there. He's one of the top plays this week as well. And I talked about earlier on the week on some other articles of media where we discussed that a lot of sites don't necessarily have that game on their big slates. So people are going to seem to forget about him. So on smaller sites, especially like rosters, who have that Monday night slate on their games, take advantage of that. That ownership for an unnecessary reason is going to be too low. So be sure to take advantage of that. My top quarterback this week, other than Breeze, I think we got to talk about Big Ben. I mean, so far this season, he leads the NFL in touchdown passes. Not a lot of people were discussing him this week. Everyone's talking about Breeze, Ryan, Luck, and for good reason. So I think Ben Roethlisberger is going to be a guy that goes way under owned. Speaking of that, we have ownership percentages up for the Fantasy Aces GPP from Thursday to Monday. It's a great way to check out the ownerships and make your tournament lineups. That's up on rotocurve.com. Big Ben's 3% owned. I'm going to take Big Ben all day long at 3%, especially in tournaments. As I mentioned, he leads the NFL in touchdown passes. He's 14th in passing attempts, but the Steelers haven't really been behind at all. They've been leading for most of the games so far this season, which is why D'Angelo Williams has about 9 million touches. Big Ben is second in the NFL in fantasy points per attempt at 0.67. That's excellent. The Eagles have an excellent front seven, as we've talked about before. That secondary, other than the safeties, leaves a little bit to be desired. The Otis McKellen is probably not playing this weekend. So that leaves Nolan Carroll and maybe a rookie in Jalen Mills as those top two guys to defend Antonio Brown and Sammy Coates or Eli Rogers. That's not good enough for me. So for me, it's just 7,300. He's cheaper than 5 others. He has a chance to be a top 3 guy. At a 3% own right now, I got to take that risk. Adam, who's your second guy?
So I think I need to invest in this dude's jersey because I've pretty much talked about him every week so far this season. Marcus Mariota continues to be in good spots. Didn't have the greatest game in week 2, but obviously, was good enough. He had around 230 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. He's done that now in 2 straight games, so relatively nice floor there. And it's just a matchup. I mean, Oakland has been so bad on defense. So the first team, according to Pro Football Reference, to allow 500 yards of total offense in each of their first 2 games. Like that's just insane. Sean Smith is struggling. They don't really have, they're not gelling exactly how we thought they would in the beginning of the season. Over 400 passing yards, 7 total passing touchdowns through 2 weeks, and they struggle to defend the middle of the field, which is an area where the Titans, when they throw the football, really target. According to Pro Football Focus, 20 of Mariota's 25 completions last week were in that area. Now, keep an eye on Delaney Walker. He's actually listed as questionable with a hamstring. So if he misses, I'll definitely downgrade Mariota because, outside of Delaney Walker, he really only has Sterling or Tajay Sharp catching passes. So that would be a knock. But as of right now, Mariota playing pretty well. Nice fantasy upside with the rushing. So I'll definitely be looking at him. And his price, I mean, he went down. He's 5,900 on DraftKings against Oakland. So it's hard not to be interested in that.
Yeah, I agree with you there. He's one of my favorite plays this week, and he's actually listed as the number 1 quarterback in RotoCurve's quarterback cheat sheet this week for the Sunday only slate. Of course, for both games or both days slate, Sunday and Monday, he's listed as number 2, sandwiched between Ryan and Bree. So that's pretty good company. Jim, who's your second quarterback this week?
Well, because I'm an older guy, I want to reference the 1973 Falcons gave up 500 yards to start off the season that year. I looked it up, to the New Orleans Saints and the Los Angeles Rams. So I don't know, just a nerd. But in any case, my middle QB here is actually Ryan Tannehill. Again, the big favorite here, so there could be some worries that they get up big and run, but I don't even think that Miami's built to run, honestly. They got that patchwork backfield. I think, you're going to see a situation where he's still going to drop back 35-plus times. Last week was all garbage time points, a little bit Blake Bortles-esque, for Ryan Tannehill there. But still, he completed 21 of 22 coming out of the half last week. And the other thing is, too, just personnel-wise. I think, again, beating up on these guys, Trayvon Williams, Jamar Taylor. Joe Hayden is still a guy, he's playing well this year. He's number 2 on Pro Football Focus and coverage grade. At the same time, I just think this is a position where Cody Kessler is going to offer up field position, extra possessions. There's a lot to like here about Miami situation. It's also one of these things where they've had such a brutal start on the road. I think they're really going to want to open it up here. I don't think Gase is the kind of guy who's going to pull. I don't think this situation, narrative-wise, that they're going to want to pull back if they get up. This isn't a team that can sit there and close this game out comfortably. I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to try to score as it goes. And as we get into receivers, I also like, a stack and maybe even 2 stack options for Miami. So I think it's just a great situation. I have him projected right near Ben, actually, only because there are some game flow fears with Ben, too, getting up big. So I think Tannehill is one of these guys who's going to score around 20 fantasy points, and he's not going to cost you much, let you pay up at those skill positions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there, Jim. We're definitely going to talk a lot about that passing offense today. So a little bit of a cliffhanger there.
Yeah.
My quarterback at number 2 this week is the chalk. There's no way to argue against that. We actually have that data backed up with the Fantasy Aces ownership percentages. Phillip Rivers, the highest owned quarterback in that big GPP on Fantasy Aces. He will probably be one of the highest owned quarterbacks in all of your DraftKings, FanDuel, and rosters contests this weekend in cash games, but for good reason. I mean, we talked about Rivers earlier this week, and we talked about him last week. Maybe his prospects looks a little bleak without Keenan Allen. Of course, he lost Danny Woodhead. But the guy threw 4 touchdowns on just 24 attempts as the Chargers went up huge again. I don't know how they're 1-1 as they've been crushing both teams. But alas, that things like that happen in the NFL. So Phillip Rivers has thrown a lot of touchdowns already this year and not that many attempts. He faces the Colts, who were without their top 2 corners, at just $6,700. Phillip Rivers is cheaper than 11 quarterbacks on DraftKings this week. That's a lot, considering the fact that he has definitely the potential to be a top 7, maybe even a top 5 play. That's a bargain in and of itself. This game has the highest over-under in the Sunday slate, as Adam mentioned earlier, with Andrew Luck. The one thing I look at with Rivers has always been volume. He's always very highly ranked up on the volume, throws the ball a ton. But his attempts are a little bit down this year because, like Adam said earlier this week, the Chargers have been crushing other teams. We know at some point they're going to be coming from behind. We know he's going to be throwing a lot of passes. Considering he's number 3 in fantasy points per passing attempt right now at 0.64 per, that's an excellent number to combine with that volume. So for me, number 2, I'm going with the chalk and a guy that will probably find his way into a lot of my cash lineups this week, and that's Phillip Rivers. Jim, you mentioned your number 2 guy. What do you think about your value guy? I mean, I think this is one of those weeks where there's a lot of other guys that you can talk about at other positions. Maybe you spend down a quarterback. If you're doing that, who's your guy?
Yeah, to go the Ricky Sanders route, right? To spend down at quarterback. I think Ricky texted me last night that he found his pay down cash quarterback. I don't know who it is yet. Maybe it's Jeff George, but I think it's actually a guy that I don't mind. I know that there's a kind of a low floor in the sense that he hasn't thrown a passing touchdown yet, but I think there's a correction coming there as well. But Dak Prescott, we just saw a completely clean pocket the whole night. The only time that Carson Wentz got in trouble was when he pulled an RG3 and ran into guys. I really think that there's just the floor is high with the rushing for one, and then honestly just like targets, and there's going to be some natural correction here, right? A positive correction in the sense that he's actually completing a good number of his passes. He's throwing it 37 times a game, and his targets really haven't been playing bad between Beasley, Witten, and obviously Des Bryant, who showed some promise last week. Look, Dak didn't have a passing touchdown last week. He had the rushing touchdown, but still he had 18 points on DraftKings. So, I mean, I don't think that's his floor, but I think it's a reasonable kind of median projection for him to have 16-plus points in this game. And honestly, there's a real argument to be made that the Bears might be one of the most listless, kind of there's just no energy in that team. And now they're without, Lamar Houston's out and Jenny Trevathan broke his hand, had surgery. So he's their best coverage linebacker. Freeman's a good run stopper, but I just think there's going to be a lot of fun over the middle there for them. And that's where Dak's going to do his damage, just underneath routes. So, I just think if you can really pay down, there's a real discount on him. So I think some of these other cheaper guys are not cheap enough for me to pivot off of the Tannehill crowd or the Mariota crowd. I think there's enough savings here.
Absolutely. Adam, you're cheap guy at quarterback. I know who you're going to talk about, and I think it's something that a lot of people really need to keep an eye on. This guy always goes underowned, no matter what. Who is it?
Yeah, I'm kind of terrified, honestly, but he's really cheap, and I think what I like to do when I'm looking at matchups is, and I talked about it a lot, and a lot of people in the industry talk about it, you want to look for funnel defenses, and right now, with the way their secondary looks and the way their run-stopping ability looks, the Jets are a funnel defense. And, Alex Smith had a rough game, and he was under duress a lot against Houston, and that could be the case here. But the Jets secondary has played very poorly. We know what's going on with Darrelle Revis. I think in this game, Spencer Ware's looked pretty strong, but I don't know if the Chiefs are going to be able to run the ball a lot in this game. Alex Smith is only 5,800. He's cheaper than Fitzpatrick. He's cheaper than he's the same price as Tyrod. I just think even though the Chiefs don't go downfield a lot, the Jets give up a ton of big plays in the air. We saw it against the Bills, and Alex Smith doesn't throw the ball downfield a lot, but if there's a ability and opportunity to do so, I think there's an opportunity for Macklin to get open against his defense. I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball. I just have a sneaky feeling that Alex Smith's going to have one of these Alex Smith games where nobody's on him and he attempts a lot of passes. I mean, so far this season, in 2 games, 48 and 37 pass attempts. We don't really see that from Alex Smith a lot. Granted, he was outstanding in the come from behind victory against San Diego and just brutal against Houston, but at home, he's played a lot better. I can see Alex Smith providing some value this week, and nobody's going to be on him at all.
I agree. That ownership for him is always low. He's actually a guy in seasonal that a lot of people like to stream simply because of the fact that he always ends up throwing a lot of attempts in certain games, but he's always free off the waiver wire. And in DFS, that translates. He's always very cheap. So that wraps up quarterbacks. I want to recap real quick. I know Jim really likes Drew Brees, and who can argue with him? I'm with him. He also mentioned Ryan Tannehill as his mid-tier guy, and Dak Prescott is a very interesting option as a cheap guy. Like you said, now he hasn't thrown a passing touchdown yet, but 18 DraftKings points last week, that's not a mistake. Adam likes Andrew Luck, likes Marcus Mariota, And Alex Smith is a very interesting option to be a cheap to use, and I actually don't disagree with him at all, and I may try to use him
Full
in a few of my
disclaimer, I
lineups.
would 100% play Dak over him, but like I didn't want to pick Dak obviously, but like I don't know, Alex Smith could have one of these again, a situation where if Kansas City can't run the ball, then who knows? I mean, the Jets secondary has played poorly.
Right, like week 1, he had to throw.
Yeah.
He had to, and like you guys said, with the fact that he can take shots deep if he needs to, he doesn't really like to. He may get Jamal Charles back, although we're not very sure if that's going to happen.
I believe Charles is almost all but certain to be out.
Okay, so there you go. Spencer Ware, 900 receptions again.
Yeah.
So yeah, wrapping up with quarterback, the two guys that I liked were Ben Roethlisberger and Phillip Rivers. I also like Marcus Mariota as my cheap guy, 5,900 on DraftKings. It's hard to go that route. So let's move on to running backs here. This is very interesting position so far this year. It's been one of those positions where if you paid up in both weeks, a lot of winning lineups had some of those top backs, and most of that due to D'Angelo Williams. So, Jim, we'll start with you. D'Angelo has been the guy for week 1. And you like him in week 3?
Yeah, I mean, it's just simple. I mean, the Eagles, they haven't really been challenged by the run a ton so far, but they're really, we're Eagles fans. We can tell. I don't think a lot of personnel shift has happened here. And if anything, the wide 9 and this kind of aggressive 4-man rush they do with their spacing, kind of a little offset of the tackles, it actually opens up lanes, I think, in the sense of guys getting to the second level. And honestly, just workload-wise, you don't need – you've already discussed it. He leads the league in touches. They're road favorites, so there's an element there that usually is tied into rushing volume. It's just, in general, there's really not – again, it's almost like the Breeze endorsement. You don't need to be convinced to take D. Will. I just think that, when you're comparing him to other guys, you've said this before with NBA guys, in terms of checking boxes. This guy checks all the boxes. He has dominant market share of both passing and rushing. And then, obviously, all the goal line attempts. The Steelers lead the league in goal line attempts for their running backs dating back to the last 2 years. So it's just opportunity and it's talent. And I don't know how he's doing this at 33, but he is. And, again, my gut says that this is one of those games where the Eagles actually get down a good amount. I just think it's kind of a little too good to be true these first couple of games. And also, just this is a really good team. They might put them on their back a little bit, and I think that could lead to another 25-touch game. So he's the chalk in the sense that he's just so trustworthy, he's so bankable. Again, like Breeze, highest floor, highest ceiling.
Yeah, he's the number 1 owned percentage back right now at 32% on Fantasy Aces. So, like you said, he's the chalk, but for good reason. There's been a reason why he's been the number 1 running back basically since the first week of the season. This is going to be the last week he has that full workload too. So the Steelers may just keep handing him the ball and handing him the ball and handing him the ball. So be sure to take advantage of that. Adam, your number 1 is a guy that's priced in a similar range, probably the most talented running back in that price range. Who is it?
Yeah, real quick on D'Angelo Williams, I think you're really risking fading him. Like, I think you're just taking a very big chance on fading him because he leads the league in touch percentage, he leads the league in touches, he leads the league in snaps. So, good luck fading him. Last 11 starts, over 1,000 rushing yards. He's been outstanding. But I think because D'Angelo has been so good and he's up in that price range, David Johnson's probably not going to be highly owned, especially on the road against Buffalo. And while I don't think it's a great matchup for his rushing ability, he's just so good in the passing game. And, I think there was a report that he was kind of benched in week 2. I don't know if that was because he wasn't, running his routes fully, he wasn't, giving it 100%, or if it was just a blowout. But either way, he's averaging just under 18 touches per game. That would be higher if Tampa Bay wasn't getting destroyed last week. Playing 80% of the snaps, which is good because a lot of people were worried about Chris Johnson and Andre Ellington in the offseason. And I love his just ability in the passing game. He has at least 100 scrimmage yards in each of his last 6 starts, averaging 137 total yards per game to start the season. And this is a good matchup for his ability out of the backfield to catch the ball. Buffalo's linebackers are really bad. They're inexperienced. They're not good in coverage. He's averaging his ADOT, average at the target, is at 6.6, which is the second highest among running backs. Pretty high number. And they line him up out wide. Like he doesn't have just, pass catching floor. He has pass catching upside because when he's targeted, he's making big plays. So I think he's going to go under-owned. I think he's right there with Le'Veon when healthy as the most talented running back in the NFL. The only thing I don't like about David Johnson is Arizona throws the ball in the red zone so much, but when they do run it, it's going to be him, and I think Buffalo will keep this game close enough. Like it doesn't even matter because he's one of the few game script proof running backs in the NFL. So David Johnson, he's pricey, but he's going to be under-owned and has high upside in pretty much any matchup.
Yeah, no doubt there. And like you said, if you did want to, and I mean this is bold, but if you did want to fade D'Angelo Williams, which you never know what's going to happen, David Johnson is a very good, interesting option there in tournaments to pivot. And like Adam said, his floor is high, his upside is high. So with that price range, we can fit both of them. Why not? My running back this week is I really love D'Angelo Williams, but I think a guy a little bit cheaper that goes under the radar is DeMarco Murray. It pains me to say this, but DeMarco Murray has turned into a PPR superstar in the first 2 weeks of the season. 12 catches on 14 targets in 2 games. We talked about earlier this week on the running back daily beef, so be sure to check that out. That's enough targets to be completely okay with the running backs back. The guy also has 25 carries in 2 games as well, and he's the leading toucher in that backfield in Tennessee. Derrick Henry is getting some snaps, but DeMarco Murray's the guy there. Add all that opportunity onto the matchup they have this week against the Raiders, who just can't stop us three. It's going to be one of those games where I think he goes 2 under-owned because he's in that middle tier pricing in the 6,000s on DraftKings. People be paying up for D'Angelo or paying down for these running backs that are going to be substitutes this week with the injuries. I think Murray's going to go under-owned right now. And looking at that right now, he's 11% owned Thursday to Monday tournament. For a running back, that's very good, especially given the fact that he's 5th on the running back cheat sheet. His first 2 weeks, he combined for over 44 DraftKings points. I'm all on board with DeMarco Murray, and it's odd to say that because he looked like he was running in molasses last year, right, Jim?
Oh man, he looked like he had a backpack, full of bricks. It was awful, but no, yeah, it's less predictive too. His usage isn't as predictable as that Chip Kelly setup. So there's a little bit more that exotic smash mouth. There offers a little bit more, I don't know, play diversity. So yeah, he just looks better, to be honest. I'm not afraid to admit that he looks a lot better than last year, and he's being used, in space a lot better than he was last year.
Absolutely. Now, Jim, who's your number 2 back this week?
I mean, I'm covered in chalk this week. I'm like Kevin Garnett or maybe even LeBron walking up to the talc line. I'm going with Melvin Gordon here. This is safe. I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't seen, if his ownership numbers also sky high. It's just, again, my floor for him, projected just floor is 13 points on DraftKings. He was targeted on 16% of his routes last week, and I think if you actually took the Woodhead routes and used them in, we're talking about a 20%, target per route rate. Because let's be honest, Kenneth Farrow isn't going to get much work. This is a consolidated backfield now. For all the value that we had independently, we even had independent value from Melvin Gordon last week, right? In the sense of that he could have, some touchdown upside. And we also had independent value for Danny Woodhead, as his PPR floor. Now those guys are combined into one workload. And then all you have to do is talk about the Colts. They've allowed 2.5 yards before contact over the last year. And, they've just been like an absolute sieve to opposing running backs right now. They're giving up 33% more fantasy points to running backs than any other team. So it's a matchup to pound. I think actually one way it might even eat into Rivers a little bit, and that's, I'll discuss that later, is that I just think this could really be one of those games where this is 25 plus touches, and they try to actually keep Andrew Luck off the field a little bit. The Chargers on the road are almost a little bit like the Saints to me. They're really not themselves on the road, and I wouldn't be surprised if this feeds into a Gordon game.
That's an interesting point there, and I really hope that you're right, and I think a lot of people will too, because I'm going to be Gordon a lot as well. Adam, your number 2 running back is a guy that is very low owned. We can check that on the Fantasy Aces ownership percentages at RotoCurve.com. He is low owned already. Now, why do you think he's a good play?
First of all, let me make a disclaimer. He is not my number 2 overall running back. He's
exactly.
He's my kind of mid-tier tournament option. It's a little risky, but the Packers offense is going to get on track, and when they do, Eddie Lacy is going to have one of these big games, and nobody's going to be on him. And I think this could be the week. There was a report from ESPN that the coaching staff wants to get Lacy in the running game going. And the Packers offense right now has shown zero upside in big playability, which is concerning. I mean, they're right now through 2 weeks of the season, they're averaging 4.5 yards per play. That's that's ahead of 2 teams right now, the Niners and the Rams. That's terrible company to be in. But the Lions are allowing 6.5 yards per play, the sixth highest mark in the NFL, and they're extremely banged up right now on defense. I mean, Ziggy Ansah probably isn't going to play. Kyle Van Noy's hurt. You have DeAndre Levy hurt. So they're really banged up. And, this is kind of a good matchup sneakily because they're allowing over 5 yards per carry through 2 weeks. I know Lacey's not getting the massive workload, but I think Aaron Rodgers and the company get back on track in a big way here. They have a high team total at home. Lacey's still going to get the goal line opportunities. And, again, low ownership, pretty low price for a guy in this offense that I still think is going to be fine. I'm not panicking on Green Bay just yet. They played, a road game in Jacksonville and were decent, and then they played Minnesota at home in their first game in the new stadium and weren't that good. So I think Lacey at 6,100 on DraftKings is going to be really low owned. People are going to be off this Packers offense other than maybe the passing game. People still have last year in their mind from Lacey, and I think he's going to have one of these 115-yard, 2-touchdown games, and I want to be on it when it happens, and I think this could be the week.
It's an interesting point there because, like you said, the Packers' offense has really looked bad, really bad. So it's going to be one of those things where at a low ownership, if he gets that 115 and 2 touchdown, that's going to propel you up the leaderboards in tournaments. Now, for me, I'm going to talk about 2 value running backs because I know you guys both have strong feelings about a particular dinosaur for the Colts. So real quick, I'm going to talk about Theo Riddick and Charles Sims. Both of these guys are now the starting running backs because of injuries to Amir Abdullah in Detroit and Doug Martin in Tampa Bay. So first things first, I wanted to talk about Riddick. The guy saw 10 targets through 2 weeks with 18 carries, so 28 touches. That was with Abdullah being there. Now with Abdullah out, he's going to be picking up the slack. And I think what a lot of people are looking at for the Detroit Lions running back, this is not a great matchup. But the way I look at it, the front 7 that they're going to be facing in the Packers is excellent. So the way I look at that, when a quarterback's under pressure, what do? They dump the ball off. So that's exactly what we're going to see with Riddick. Maybe he sees 10 to 12 receptions as a ceiling, which is excellent for PPR formats. So I'm going to be looking at that, especially considering the fact that the guy is averaging a half a PPR point per snap. He's going to see a boost in snaps. That stat alone is enough for me to look at it. As for Sims, he won't be splitting the workload as much as Riddick will be with Dwayne Washington, but I think he has an excellent chance to succeed this week for the same reason. He faces that Rams front 7. They can put a lot of pressure on you. Jameis Winston dump the ball off to Sims or Doug Martin in the passing game. So without Doug Martin, Sims is going to be the guy to get that workload. So for 2 guys in a very similar matchup at a very similar price, actually the same on a few sites, I'm looking at both of them. And you can actually have both of them for a combined $9,800 on DraftKings. That's enough for me. Now, I know you guys love Frank Gore. I'm just going to let the cat out of the bag, but I want to hear you guys go back and forth on why you think he could be a better option potentially over the Riddicks or over the Charles Simses of the world. Jim, why don't we start with you?
Well, I won't take up too much time. I'll leave Adam some matchup trends here, but really just the Chargers are awful against the run. I mean, to keep it simple, I mean, they've allowed the most yards before contact over the last year, over 3 yards before contact per rush, which basically just means you're starting off. It's like starting off in like a 3-0 count. It's like you're just in a really favorable situation as a running back to create, to get to the second level. I mean, look, he's obviously near the twilight of his career. Just taking one highlight from last week, I mean, he's being leveraged in the passing game more than he was last year, actually. There's actually more deployment, more routes, more targets. I mean, you're talking about a guy who's on pace for 45, 50 receptions. That's not like truly sustainable. I think this is a situation where a big shootout, and all the ingredients for a shootout are there. And honestly, there's really not much competition for touches. Turbin, Richardson, these guys aren't really or Ferguson rather, these guys really aren't going to etch into the important work. He's got nearly sole claim of goal line touches. And once again, the Manti Te'o is terrible in coverage. There's all these factors here. Corey Lugic isn't good. There's no run stuffers on this defensive line. They went small and speedy with their defensive front in that kind of weird Andy Reid kind of sense. So I just think that there's a lot here to like about Gore. And I think the floor is really high. I'm not sure the ceiling's incredibly high, but when you're paying down like this and you're getting a guy at 5K, I think, cost certainty is actually helpful. And he might, I don't know, there's more cost certainty, I think, than going with those Riddick, Sims guys, maybe in a sense, just because I think there's more touchdown floor here.
Yeah, Riddick and Sims, I would agree they have more upside, but I don't know. I think I'm a sucker for these old veterans. Like I just
Hmm.
never like completely want them to be done. And Frank Gore had a nice, impressive receiving touchdown against Denver where he kept his balance on the sideline and then dove over the pile. But 9 targets through 2 weeks, which is nothing to scoff at. Now Moncrief's out, and the Chargers, like Jim said, their linebackers are so bad in coverage, and through 2 weeks, they're allowing the most targets per game to opposing running backs at 13, the most receptions per game at 11 and a half. Talked about Teo in coverage. He's really, really bad. Colts have a high home implied team total. Chargers are allowing a lot of red zone opportunities too. They've allowed touchdown in 6 of their 8 red zone trips. We know Gore's going to get the short yardage work, especially because over the last 5 years he leads the NFL in carries inside the opponent's 1 yard line. So I think 2 touchdowns and 70 yards is absolutely in reach for Frank Gore here, and he's only $5,000. Like on FanDuel, I think he's cheaper than the mess in Miami and some other less than stellar situations. So for me, it's Frank Gore is going to be a guy I'm really looking at. And then I guess one guy to maybe consider outside of Frank Gore if I had to pick. If Thomas Rawls is ruled out, Christine Michael's in a decent spot at home against the Niners, who have been so bad against the run when on the road, around 150 yards per game. So
It's an interesting point, and you guys are starting to sway me a little bit. I love these young guys, the quick guys.
play him,
the
dude.
flash.
Play Frank Gore.
I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can look on Monday morning and see Frank Gore and just.
Right.
You know what I mean? But then again, if you see Thea Riddick with 1 carry, 9 yards, I'm gonna be like, all right, well.
I just think it's
should have
funny
listened to
that
Adam and Jim.
D'Angelo Williams is 33 and he's the chalk. So.
It's funny. That's very true. I think Jonathan Stewart may have saved him by them splitting snaps. Maybe it gave a little bit of a revitalization to D'Angelo Williams' career.
And what's his face? The hell's his name? From was that Stephen Davis and Deshaun Foster or whatever.
Tolbert. And
yeah, those guys just kept
Cam
going.
Newton.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely. Now we just wrapped up running backs there. I think we're going to have a little bit of a side bet with those value guys in Gore, Riddick, or Charles Sims. We all love D'Angelo Williams for sure. I mentioned DeMarco Murray as well. Jim and Adam and I all like Melvin Gordon. He's the chalk, so I definitely think he's worth playing. And I really liked Adam's options, especially in tournaments, and David Johnson and Eddie Lacy. Their ownerships are going to be low, but they do have that excellent upside. So moving on to receivers. It's the fun part for me. You guys know I love wide receivers, love PPR formats, and this is where a ton of points are scored, ton of points. Adam, let's start with you because I know you have a guy that he likes to catch the football a little bit, wouldn't you say?
I mean, didn't last week for somehow. So Antonio Brown is not going to have 2 bad games in a row. It's just not going to happen. He was held under 40 receiving yards for the second time over the last 4 seasons against the Bengals last week, and they play him. Give him credit. They play him differently. I talked about it. They double him a lot. They play him a lot differently than other teams do. But even if McKelvin was active, like Antonio Brown is going to destroy. I'm sure you guys can attest to this. He's going to destroy the likes of Nolan Carroll and Ron Brooks and Jalen Mills. Like he might have 15 to 20 catches in this game if game flow allows it. Like he's just always going to be open. Number 1 receivers have destroyed the Eagles. Since the start of last season, 13 of the last 17 receivers they faced have gone for either 80 yards or a touchdown. We know Antonio Brown is an insanely high floor. Really not much else to say. Like I think Antonio Brown is right there with Julio, obviously, and maybe even number 1 with Julio being banged up a little bit. And I'd be shocked if Antonio Brown didn't go for 100 yards and or a touchdown in this game. He should eat.
That's for sure. Now, Jim, you have another guy that can just eat, like Adam said, in PPR formats. Who's
Lacy
that guy you're
plays
targeting
receiver?
this week?
He
I didn't know Eddie
does.
Lacy
like
played
that.
receiver. I didn't know that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Eddie Lacy with his sliders. Because he went from full burger to sliders. It's the P90X plan. But I'm going with Jarvis Landry. I think he's quite stackable with Tannehill. Again, like in terms of shadow fears, Hayden shadowed about only 3 times out of 5 games last year. I don't know if this is one of those setups because you're going to see Landry out of the slot. I just looked it up. 56 out of his 74 routes this year out of the slot. I actually think it's also one of those situations in terms of funneling targets. I think Arian Foster's role might actually splinter a little bit and end up in the hands of Landry here, just in terms of like it's a similar idea, a little offset slot, all that underneath stuff. We won't count Tavon Austin because he's actually leading the NFL in percentage of targets on his team. He's got 34% of the Rams
He's
targets.
the GOAT.
He's the
so
GOAT.
Good.
He's got 34.4% of his team's targets, but Landry's got 32% of his team's targets, which is just an amazing amount. So basically, as Tannehill goes, if you're going to tie yourself to Tannehill, you might as well actually just put him in with Landry. Landry's affordable. He doesn't come at this super high price. I think he's a kind of an ideal number 2. If you're going to want to go with an Antonio Brown, you can still get a guy with kind of the really high floor, the 15, 14 plus kind of range in terms of just that PPR floor is so high for Landry. I don't know. I just think it's one of those weeks where, obviously last week he had a second most yards in his career. So I think there's just the rapport is still there. We kept looking for Devontae Parker and these other guys to eat into his workload. They just work such different jobs, right? Don't have overlap in their usage. They're different guys. They're different guys. I actually even like Parker, to be honest. I didn't mention him in my mid-tier or anything like that, but this is my top-tier guy, but I just think Parker is also a guy that you can get away with stacking if you want to go a little cheaper. But to keep it simple, Jarvis Landry, target hog. I just think he's kind of like your working man's Antonio this week.
Yeah, and Rich Rebar has his worksheet article at RotoWorld, and he pointed out and dug into some numbers that Landry's actually better when Parker's on the field. Like, he has really strong per-game averages. And, yeah, I think he's super safe in cash because he's a lock for targets. 13 of his last 18 games, he's seen double-digit targets. We saw what Jordan Matthews did against his team out of the slot in Week 1. They let Mike Wallace score 2 touchdowns last week, so he's going to be a cash game staple for me.
Yeah, Tremont Williams all day, right?
It's going to be Tremont Williams and Jamar Taylor.
Exactly.
And Joe Hayden actually might not even play. He popped up on the injury report this afternoon, so we'll see.
It just keeps getting juicier, doesn't it? I feel weird that you guys kept talking about AB and Jarvis Landry because I'm starting to look at my phone or something and just starting to hack into my cash lineup, it seems like. So the guy that I want to mention here is a top option for me in tournaments, Allen Robinson. He hasn't shown up in 2016, has a lot of targets, but has not necessarily shown up in the production level. But I think this is the week that turns around. The targets, as I just mentioned, he saw 20 in his first 2 games, but 15 came in Week 1. Last week he only saw 5, but that was against Jason Verrett, who, despite being about 7 feet shorter than Allen Robinson, he's still able to limit him. So it's an excellent corner there. I'm not necessarily worried about the production against the top corner, as he's not facing one this week. Jimmy Smith. Last season, the Ravens allowed 26 touchdowns to wide receivers, second most in the NFL. Jimmy Smith had a lot to do with that. We know about the volume in the Jags passing offense. It's another reason to like Allen Robinson. I think he's far too cheap. Now, it sounds weird saying that for a guy in the 7,000s on DraftKings, but he has the same upside as the A.J. Greens, the Odell Beckhams, the Des Bryants of the world, even the Antonio Browns, depending on game flow. So a guy like this for 2,000 less, I think is an excellent option to go with in tournaments because you can have the similar upside but still have money to spend up on running backs. Another thing I looked at, that ownership percentages I keep mentioning for Fantasy Aces, he's 14% owned, which is a little bit higher than I thought, but listen to this. He's higher or lesser owned than Travis Benjamin, Tyrell Williams, and Tajay Sharp. So basically, when the contest locks, the prices are set, and you really just pay attention to ownership percentage. For a guy that has that upside, be it lesser ownership for those guys, for me, I'm way in. One more thing to add about this real quick. Bortles has 10 red zone attempts already. We know about Allen Robinson's volume in the red zone last year, so I'm just going to stay with that. What do you guys think about A-Rob in tournaments? Adam, we'll start with you.
I'm going to play him a lot, and he's probably going to have 2 touchdowns. First of all, buy low on Allen Robinson in seasonal if you can. I like the matchup with Jimmy Smith. Chris Ivory might play, but I still don't think they're going to run the ball in the red zone because they just don't do that. And Robinson, if you look at his efficiency rate on his targets, he isn't catching a lot of them, but he went against Jason Verrett last week, and then in Week 1 he went against Sam Shields, and Green Bay corners were all over him. Those targets were not easy catches, so don't worry about Allen Robinson. I'm going to keep playing him each week until he goes off, and honestly, it would not surprise me at all if it was this week.
It's one of those things where the talent, the numbers have to catch up with the talent, right? This isn't just a role. He has the role plus the talent, right? So it's a huge catch radius, contested catch monster. This is almost like the sins of just 2 really bad cornerback matchups combined with the fact that Bortles has been on his basically just hasn't played well. He's, getting his feet are dancing. I think this is a situation at home where, there's not much of a pass rush for Baltimore. Like at least an honest pass rush. They're going to have to blitz to really create pressure. So I just think that, there's an opportunity. And Robinson's the kind of guy, he can make your day in one play. There's not many of these receivers that we're talking about. Like Landry can't do that really. So this is the kind of guy who in just one or two huge kind of vertical plays, returns cash.
Landry can make your day in like 8 or 9 plays though.
8.5. It's 8.5 plays on average. Yeah.
I'm telling you, it's every time you guys talk about those two, all I can think of is hacking into my cash lineups. I can't get that out of my head. But
they're going to combine for like 30 catches.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
Maybe
with you. I
30.
think we're all going to have him, and I expect that ownership to be ridiculous. Now, Adam, I know you have 2 interesting names in your middle tier because they're actually top tier talents, but middle tier prices. So who are those guys? You want to talk about them real quick?
Yeah, real quick. We'll start with Larry Fitzgerald, who's doing it again. He's just second year in a row. He's just dominating the start of the season. 13 of 20 targets he's caught for 158 yards and 3 touchdowns through 2 weeks. And this is a good spot for him because he lines up in the slot, and that means he'll see some of Nikel Roby-Coleman, who's 5'8", 165 pounds. Fitzgerald is 6'3", 218, and is one of the best 7 or 8 receivers in the history of the NFL. Coleman is a guy who's really not that good, so he could just destroy him. I talked about how Arizona likes to throw the ball in the red zone. Fitzgerald leads the league in targets inside the 10 so far. I just think he's got big play potential against this Bills secondary. They gave up a ton of big plays if it's Patrick and company last Thursday. And then the other guy I think is going to go really overlooked is Amari Cooper. He's priced kind of awkwardly to where people are going to just go up or go down rather than pay the price tag for him. On DraftKings right now, he's about, what is he, 7,700, so like that's kind of an awkward price point. But another potential funnel defense is the Titans. They have a strong front. They're strong against the run so far this season. And Amari Cooper, we're starting to see him. Last year was Crabtree who was the number 1 guy. Now it seems to be Amari Cooper finally. 20 targets through 2 weeks, and he had 0 targets inside the 10 all of last season. He already has 2 this season. The Titans have allowed over 100 yards to both number 1 receivers they face this year in Stephon Diggs and Marvin Jones. And PFF has them as a 31st ranked secondary through 2 weeks. I think Amari Cooper goes for 100 and a touchdown in this game, and a little bit overlooked.
That's an interesting point. Now, Jim, before I go to you, is everything all right over there? It sounded like when I mentioned Amari Cooper, you just kind of slammed a glass on the ground. You okay?
Yeah, I have a, I write a lot, so I have this, I'm going to be honest, I have a mustard bowl. I have a bowl that I put mustard in for my pretzels, and it's on the ground now, okay? So we've had a loss here, but that's part of the cost the cost of doing business, really. It's a dangerous job being a fantasy writer.
Yeah, that's definitely. We should all get hazard pay for somebody.
I really should. I mean, I'm thinking about calling Progressive after this, but no, Tyrell Williams. I'm pretty chalky here today. But just you saw that 44-yard touchdown that he had last week. It was pretty slick. It was a lot of stuff that he did himself on the underneath route there, and honestly, just last man standing kind of stuff, right? I mean, Benjamin is the guy who might draw Vontae Davis if he's back. Clayton Geathers is back, from what I understand, so at least there'll be some over-the-top help. It's narrative-based in the sense that you're predicting game flow a little bit, or even just personnel flow, I guess what you want to call it. Like in terms of, I don't really know what the Colts, are going to do defensively, but I would think, Travis Benjamin's the guy you key on. And Williams has kind of a similar target per route rate, 24% of his routes, 26% of his routes since Keenan Allen went down, he's been targeted on. Number 2 guy on an offense that's going to have to pass on the road to keep up with this luck offense. If we're predicting that this matches the implied point total, someone's going to have to eat, right, in the passing game.
Gates is questionable, right?
Yeah, Gates is questionable, and Gates, honestly, he just looks – I mean, I know we continue to value Gates for that touchdown, and I understand that, but he's purely a touchdown or bust guy at this point. Yeah. He's not even in that between the 20s kind of guy anymore. He's really just – you're just hoping – that they just do that little curl route that he runs. So really, I just think it's here for Tyrell Williams. I think the targets will be there. And if anybody's into Rivers, I'm actually fading Rivers a little bit. But to get a part of that passing game cheaply, I think Williams is the guy.
Yeah, it's a good point. The guy that I'm looking at in this next tier is We mentioned the middle tier, Fitzgerald, Amari Cooper, Tyrell Williams, a little bit of a lower middle tier. The guy that I'm looking at should not be in this tier, Stephon Diggs. I mean, look at what he did last week. That was incredible. Through 2 weeks, he has 16 catches on 20-yard targets for 285 yards and a touchdown. Not bad for a guy that was supposed to be Tavon Austin Light out of college, right?
I have a Stephon Diggs story if you want, really quick. I was covering high school football out at the opening. It's like a thing in Portland, Oregon, where the top 150 players invited by Nike. This is the summer of 2011. He's coming out, I believe, of Good Counsel down in Maryland, and we're in the lobby, and he walks out like half asleep. He slept through the bus, right? So Stephon Diggs needs a ride to the practice. Me and this other editor from ESPN, we drive him over to practice, and so really, like all of this yardage, I have so many shares of Diggs in season long, so he's paying me back for that ride that I got him. So it's nice.
That's excellent story, and the fact that we're talking about him and sleeping just makes his price perfect at 50 this week, right? I mean, what a perfect way to push that. Now, the way I'm looking at this, AP's done. They're not going to be able to run the ball against this Carolina front. Sam Bradford is kind of a dagger, but Sam Bradford looked really good last week. I mean, incredible. One of the best games he's ever played as a pro. The fact that Diggs is 5,900 or 5,100 on DraftKings is too low. If he was 6,100 on DraftKings, it's too low. So for me, he's that third guy I'm pairing with Landry and Antonio Brown. You can have 3 receivers that can all catch 10 balls, and the price combined between those 3 is really not that high. So for me, get him in your lineups. At first, I didn't think he was going to be a necessarily big tournament play because his ownership percentage. He's 5% owned on Fantasy Aces, guys. 5. That's incredible. I know some people may feel like it's chasing points, but if you look at that role, that's not the case for me. So, Jim, you want to talk about your cheap guys real quick, or maybe another quick Diggs story?
No, I can be quick here. Actually, I like 2 guys. I'll just be quick with it. The guy with Kenny Britt, going back to last year, he's top 5 in the league in air for target. So whenever he does get targeted, it's generally a vertical target. He's averaging 70+ yards right now. I mean, obviously, another low ownership guy. No one really wants to get involved in that Rams passing game. But for tournaments, when you want to scale up, he's the kind of a guy who can have 3 catches for 110 and a touchdown. One of those kind of weird, old school, kind of Devery Henderson, to pull back a name, like a Devery Henderson.
Man, what a name.
Kind of a slate shifter in the sense that as your third cheap receiver, he can do something. Another guy who I think might thrive through a little bit more volume would be Nelson Aguilar. He's really cheap. Again, talking about game flow, predicting a little bit of the score here. Like I said, I'm of the belief that I think Pittsburgh gets ahead. Their firepower could be too much here, and I just think it could leave a lot of room for Aguilar to kind of have almost like the Dolphins last week. I think the Eagles and Wentz could actually eat a little bit in the second half and pad together a pretty good day.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. When you mentioned Kenny Britt, I thought that maybe your mustard ball fell again. But the way I'm looking at this is the guy has done it. He really has. He's done it for 2 weeks in a row. He has decent targets, has decent catches. And maybe it took him 10 years to learn how to catch the ball. But if it's here, it's fantasy points. So you can't really argue with that. Adam, who's your cheap guy this week? Is there somebody that really sticks out to you in that lower tier?
Yeah, I really, really like Sterling Shepard this week. All the talk's going to be on the Odell-Norman matchup, and there was a report that came out that Norman's going to line up on Beckham whenever he lines up out wide. The Giants run 3 wide pretty much more than any team in the NFL. According to Pro Football Focus, 92% of Shepard's routes have come out of the slot, and all of his catches have come out of the slot. So that tells me that Cruz is going to be lined up against Breeland. You have Norman and Beckham, and then you have Shepard in the middle of the field against Washington. That's the best matchup of all the Giants receivers. So he's probably been their best receiver through 2 weeks, honestly, and I think his price is a little bit too low, $5,500 on DraftKings. I really, really like Sterling Shepard in this spot. I think it's a pretty good spot for him.
It looks like if you do Shepard and Diggs, and then you can even still afford Antonio Brown and still pay up at running back. So just interesting to think about all those guys in the same context.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. One other cheap guy I wanted to throw there, I actually have 2, but I'll mention the other one really quickly. The first one is Tajay Sharp. Everyone's talking about Delaney before he got hurt. Everyone's talking about Mariota. How about the guy that he's going to be throwing the ball to? Tajay Sharp's the #1 receiver right now for the Titans. He's seen 18 targets on the year, but he faced 2 pretty good secondaries in the Vikes and the Lions. The Vikings did not have Xavier Rhodes, but still have a very good system with their cornerbacks, other than Terrence Newman maybe. And, of course, Tajay Sharp stalled Darius Slay for a little while as well. This week, the Raiders don't have anybody there. They don't have anybody even close to that. considering they've given up, listen to this number, this is real, 121.4 PPR points in 2 weeks.
Oof.
That's a ridiculous number. We know about Tajay Sharp's market share in targets and yards. He hasn't scored yet. But if he gets anywhere close to even half the market share, which could have much higher than that based on this offense, I want a piece of him against this secondary. I mean, that's unbelievable. 121 PPR points in 2 weeks. He's facing a team that will allow him to succeed. Has over 95% of the snaps. I believe Adam said earlier this week he played every snap in week two as well. So he's one of those guys I just can't stay away from him. The other guy I wanted to mention real quick, I talked about him last week, 3,200, he's still there, Cole Beasley. 12.5 and 14.5 PPR points. That's not a huge ceiling. He doesn't have the ceiling to score 2 or 3 touchdowns unless he catches 2 red zone targets or something. But it's just 3,200 on DraftKings. If you really want to spend up at other positions, I'll take a 13-point floor or 10-point floor with all of those targets. 3,200, you can fit all those other guys. So for me, I think he's definitely worth using.
Yeah, I think Beasley's right above the floor on rosters as well, and they're also a PPR format, so there's also an angle there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's recap receivers real quick. We all love AB. We all love Jarvis Landry. He's going to be, and both of them are going to be in a lot of our lineups. I talked about Allen Robinson as a PPR play in those top tiers. Adam mentioned Larry Fitzgerald and Amari Cooper and 2 middle upper tier guys that could succeed this week. I really like Jim's analysis of Tyrell Williams. We talked about him talking about Nelson Aguilar, and believe it or not, Kenny Britt is actually a good DFS play this week. And I mentioned his sleeper who plays nearly every snap from the slot. That's exactly what you want for the Washington Redskins defense and Sterling Shepard. So let's move on to tight ends. I know Gronk played last night, or said he was going to play last night. Mm-hmm. So every time we talk about tight ends in DFS for the last years, it's always been Gronk or who. But this week is a little bit different. There's not a lot of guys at the top that it will be worth using. Not the high-priced guys, but there's a lot of injuries as well. So let's just break this down quickly. Adam, at tight end, who are you looking at?
Delaney Walker is okay. I think he's the top guy. I mean, the matchup is outstanding. Oakland gave up 159 yards and a touchdown to Austin Hooper and Jacob Tamme combined last week. Since 13 of the last 18 tight ends they face have 70 yards or a touchdown, and that is including like a bunch of second string guys like Craig Stevens and Kellen Davis. So like they just can't defend that position. The middle of the field is where they struggle, and that's where Delaney Walker lives. So if he's all right, I think Delaney Walker is my top guy pretty easily.
I had Delaney ranked as my number 1 as well if he does play. I think that he's one of these guys that has the potential to see a ton of targets in the middle of the field against a bad defense. So we're all in agreement basically about him. Jim, do you have any other stat that tight end, Delaney Walker?
I mean, he's just the guy, right? I mean, I think one thing is just that's where Mariota's most comfortable, and that's really what we want to find out. I mean, I think he's 3rd or 4th in the league in QBR over the last year with his tight ends. Now, obviously, that's a reciprocal relationship with Walker, but it's really just part of their game plan. They're really not an offense that's ever going to want to look too vertically. And he's second on the team in routes, which you don't see very often with tight ends because they have blocking duties. So he's really a go tight end.
Yeah, and last year he was in the top 15 in targets among all players, not just tight ends. It's an incredible amount of volume that he's going to see. He's healthy. I believe he's going to see that again this week. I'm in agreement with you guys. I want to talk about my second tight end here, and a guy that I think could really succeed, go very under the radar in terms of ownership, and that's Dwayne Allen. T.Y. Hilton is going to be covered by Jason Verrett, the Donkey Moncrief out. The other guy, Philip Dorsett, not necessarily a polished NFL receiver yet. He can burn basically anybody in the NFL. Is very quick, but he doesn't have the moves or the route tree to be able to succeed. Who's the other guy that Andrew Luck's going to throw to? For me, I think it's Dwayne Allen. Last week, the Chargers allowed 14 catches on 182 yards and a touchdown on just 22 targets to tight end. That's so far this season, rather. In a high total game, this is a guy with a low price that you can get a piece of it. We've already mentioned Manti Te'o's inability to cover everyone, and there is a bunch of jokes that can go with that, but that's for another day, of course. So Dwayne Allen for me, that tight end in that middle tier that looks good. Adam, do you have a tight end you wanted to discuss in that middle tier that potentially score a touchdown or 2?
Yeah, Dwayne Allen's the GOAT this week. Jacob Tamme on the Monday night game, especially if Julio is not 100%. He's seeing the most targets on this team right now, and Julio's outside the top 40 in targets, which is kind of ridiculous. But it's just a matchup against the Saints. They're terrible. He's I think Pro Football Focus pointed out that has the highest target percentage on routes among all tight ends so far this season. So he's running a lot of passing routes, which is good. Matt Ryan's playing pretty well. And this game should have fantasy fireworks. So Tammy, kind of has had a relatively high floor through 2 weeks.
Yeah, he's one of those guys that we talked about some older players earlier. This guy just keeps finding different jobs, and he has been successful through 2 weeks. So he's another good way to get a good piece of that game. Now, Jim, a value tight end. He's a guy that I know I loved in college. A little bit of bias there, but I want to hear you talk about Mr. Trey Burton for the Philadelphia Eagles.
Oh, Trey Burton, I like that guy. Last week he was targeted on 21% or 29% of his routes and a reception on 20% of them, which is really just to say he's not blocking very often. That's Brent Selleck's job. The mid-tier guy I like is Eric Ebron, but his selling point is almost kind of like a baby Delaney Walker in the sense that he actually only has 6 less routes run than Marvin Jones, which is to say he's also not blocking, and that was never his job. Trey Burton, kind of an athletic, kind of downfield tight end himself, again, in this kind of go mode. This offense originally was predicated kind of around Zach Ertz being their number 2 target. We actually saw that happening even early in game script, like in those design plays, those first 15, because we know that from the school of Andy Reid, that's how this offense runs. Their first 15 plays are already on the board. They're not really going to pivot off of those for really what the defense is doing, and which is to say Trey Burton could get involved early. And like I said, with regards to why Aguilar is interesting, I think game flow could make this, a 40 drop back for Wentz, which is not what they want, but it's what might have to happen if they try to contend in this game. I just think, there's really not much in terms of separation for the Eagles past, really, I don't even know if Jordan Matthews separates very well. That's why he's in the slot all the time. I just think Burton, again, it was against a bad team, but I think, there's the potential for him to kind of also these safeties for the Steelers aren't very scary, to be honest. They've been trying to get safeties, that work for them, between Sean Davis. I just think, these are that's kind of the soft spot of their defense. So I think you might be able to beat them up a little bit there. So Trey Burton, he's a guy who's not going to cost you anything. Maybe this week's Dennis Pitta, not that kind of volume, but the idea of a guy who's sub 3K who could turn in, 12 plus fantasy points.
Adam, do you have anything else to add at tight end? Maybe a cheap guy or two?
Yeah, a really cheap guy that nobody's really going to be on is CJ Uzoma from the Cincinnati Bengals. Terrible matchup for all the receivers in Cincinnati. So, like usual, I mean, the only place you can sometimes go against Denver is the tight end position. AJ Green will be matched up with Chris Harris and company. And then, you have Brandon LaFell and Tyler Boyd with Talib and Roby. So those are not good matchups for anybody. And the one area where you could have seen some success over the last year or so against Denver is a tight end. The Bengals are actually targeting tight ends at a higher percentage this season than they did last season when Eifert was healthy. And granted, that's probably because there's no Marvin Jones or Mohamed Sanu in the picture as well. But he should have scored last week. Had a touchdown. I think it was not challenged and been. And 13 targets through 2 weeks is nothing to scoff at. I think if you're looking for a really cheap tight end that could score a touchdown, you could be looking at CJ from Cincinnati.
It's an interesting point, yeah, because looking back at last week, he had that touchdown that was not challenged. His knee was down. It should have been 6 points. And on the very next play, he was targeted again in the end zone and couldn't make the catch. So that Andy Dalton's looking his way. And I agree with the theory, like you mentioned. There's no other way he's going to be looking at against those receivers. So when it gets close to the end zone,
I actually have literally 3 pieces of tight end news that just came up on Twitter. So Antonio Gates is unlikely, which means Hunter Henry is expected to play a lot of snaps.
Yeah.
They're looking for a cheap guy. Virgil Green is expected to sit, so you don't really want anybody from Denver either way. And Austin Seferian-Jenkins apparently got arrested, and the Bucs are about to release him. So Cameron Braitlife could be a thing.
If you can do it, offer Seferian-Jenkins for Kobe Fleener right now.
Just try it. I mean, think for Fleener, right?
Yeah, so all that stuff just popped up like 1, 2, 3 while I was talking about Uzoma, so that's pretty interesting.
That is interesting. Now, real quick, let's recap the tight ends. We all like Delaney Walker. We talked about Jacob Tamme. I think we all agree on Dwayne Allen as a cheap piece of that game. We mentioned some cheap guys. I like Trey Burton as well as Jim. And Adam talked about C.J. Uzomah from the Cincinnati Bengals. This last position, defense, not much to say about it, but everyone touch on one defense. I'm going to start with Carolina. Everyone's going to be looking at Seattle. Their most expensive defense. They have a great matchup against San Francisco. But for me, I like to be contrarian in tournaments with defenses because I think that is a good way to gain an edge on the rest of your opponents. I like Carolina this week against Minnesota simply because Minnesota is not going to be able to block that offensive front. Matt Khalil's gone. They have had some struggles on the offensive line. Best offensive lineman this year has been Fusco, who has left a lot to be desired in the last few years. So the way I look at it, Kawan Short's on there. They have a ton of guys that can rush the passer. Minnesota Vikings aren't going to be able to run the ball without Adrian Peterson, so you know what that means. A lot of passing attempts. When you're targeting defenses, you want them to face a quarterback that's going to be throwing a lot. Sam Bradford isn't the most nimble, so if he gets 40 attempts, that's 40 chances to get an interception or a sack. I think that happens a lot this week, so I'm going to go with Carolina. Jim, you're a big defensive guy. That's when I first started following your work, it was all about the IDP stuff. So I really want to hear about your defense for this week.
Well, I'm going to go with the Tampa Bay Bucks. I know it's also a team that Adam likes, but he's got another sweet matchup, I think, that's going to unload on us. With the way with Tampa, it just matches up well with what the Rams do, right? The Rams are still a team that works inside out. They're going to run. The Bucks are actually, on the interior with McCoy, with the way they're built with Avante David, they have a gap. They can really close the gap down really well. Even Darryl Smith, who's really just a run specialist. But, they're just built well to the run. That's comes to fruition in the numbers as well. They've only allowed, I think, 3.4 yards per carry to running backs going back to last year. It's one of these games, talk about kind of like what Adam was talking about, a funnel defense. I think this is a defense that's going to kind of force Case Keenum to get busy, which is obviously inviting, right? I mean, we want Case Keenum to try to beat us at any time. So it's just an inviting matchup. I think it's also a situation where this Tampa offense, I think if they can get anything going, which I think they will be able to in the passing phase, because I don't think the Rams are very good in the second level. I think they're really a front seven team. If Jameis can get above them, I just think it's a situation where Case Keenum playing catch-up is just really inviting.
Yeah, I agree 100% there. Now, Adam, we haven't mentioned one defense that I think a lot of people are going to like. Are you on them or somebody else?
Chalk Miami against Cleveland. Cody Kessler, they said he wasn't even close to being ready last week, and now he has to start on the road. I don't really know what else I need to say. It's Cody Kessler starting without Corey Coleman, who's out for 4 to 6 weeks. Josh Gordon's not back yet. His defense, hasn't played horribly. Like, they were good against Seattle. Maybe Seattle's just not a good offense right now, but their secondary's bad, which is a little concerning, but Cody Kessler's not going to pick them apart. I think Sue and company can get after him and Cameron Wake. So I just think it's pretty chalky, but it's hard. It's going to be hard. I mean, I was so happy to see that I could pick them up in seasonal and start them this week. So I think they have an insanely high floor this week.
I agree. They're just 3,000 on DraftKings as well. So that top overall ranked defense for most people, and they're not going to break your bank, which is a big thing in DFS. So just recap defense real quick. I really like Carolina if you're going to pay up. Adam, of course, touched on the chalk defense that all of us are going to like in Miami. And Jim mentioned Tampa Bay. It's very interesting. They will be low owned. So if you want to get a little bit of an interesting pivot there, that's a good way to use it. RotoCurve Live, we always have bold calls for what sport we're talking about. So bold calls. Jim, let's start with you because I really like yours.
Okay, I like Kenny Britt to have 100 yards and a touchdown. And I just mentioned the Tampa defense, but but again, I really think in fantasy, point allowance really doesn't drive. It's not the biggest corollary to fantasy production. It's really turnovers and sacks. I still think all of that's very possible for the Bucs to accomplish. And I just think it only takes 1 or 2 deep shots. If this guy lines up with Vernon Hargroves, I think there's some upside there. Even if Verner's not a stopper. And again, game flow wise, hey, they're going to take some deep shots, and the vertical targets we know are there for Britt. The other thing is, I don't love Phillip Rivers on the road here. This could be a kind of a gut call. It's also just kind of like a game tape call. I haven't liked him on the road. It's, like I said, a little bit Drew Brees-esque in the sense that I like him best at home. I don't even know if that's more of a narrative for me than it is really statistically based. But the idea being, I think he's outside of the top 15 quarterbacks in fantasy points. And you said, he's the number one owned guy, I believe, on the Fantasy Aces tournament. So talk about going, contrarian from chalk. I think if you avoid Rivers, you could do well setting yourself up for differentiation.
Adam, what about you? I hope your bold calls don't make me as sad as Jim did.
Yeah, we'll start with the good. I think Dwayne Allen finishes as the tight end one this week. I just think the matchup is so good. He's only pass blocking 15% of the time this season, which is a huge increase or decrease, however you want to look at it, from when Kobe Fleener was there, because Fleener would run more pass routes and Allen, the better overall player, would end up blocking. But now with Fleener gone, he's running passing routes. Moncrief's out, so he's probably going to be the top red zone guy. And we talked about it all show. Manti Te'o cannot cover. He has a 39.5 coverage grade according to PFF, which is well below the league average. Dating back to last year, tight ends averaging almost 8.5 yards per catch, 7 in fantasy points allowed to the position. So I think Dwayne Allen is in a great spot here with Andrew Luck and company at home. He will be the tight end one in fantasy, which means Jack Doyle is going to have 3 touchdowns.
Exactly.
And I don't know. For my bad one, I think maybe the only one I would take away from this is Theo Riddick. I think these cheap new starting running backs are all going to falter this week. I don't like the spot for Charles Sims, and I think they're talking about Jaquiz Rodgers, who's really a good pass blocking back. I don't like the spot for McKinnon. He's going to be listed as a starter, but he's in a bad matchup and is not going to have goal line work against a bad matchup against Carolina. Theo Riddick in PPR is the only one where I would kind of say, okay, he'll probably be all right in DraftKings and PPR, but I don't like the Carolina backs. That's going to be a mess. Like, I'm not really interested in any of these cheap back, like the Miami backs I'm not interested in because they cannot run the ball. So I don't think any of these new starting cheap backs are really going to be all that good this week.
All right, so let's just recap real quick. Jim killed my quarterbacks. Adam killed 2 of my running backs. So at least Dwayne Allen, at least we have that guy.
I only have killed Riddick. Like, Riddick and PPR is going to be fun.
No, it's going to be like Billy Madison, Jack Doyle. Doyle rules. You're going to see.
Yeah. All right, now I'm going to go with my bold call. I don't know if I got to see if I can make somebody sad here somehow. I mean, they're killing my vibes, but
I'm a Bills fan. You can start there.
Well, true.
That's not bold though, right? So.
Yeah, the Bills are going to lose.
I'm going to go with Carolina defense, 22 DraftKings points this week. Wow. I just think with Sam Bradford throwing the ball 8 million times, with all the talent they have on their defensive front, it's going to be a lot of sacks, maybe a fumble recovery, and maybe Bradford floats one of those balls to the middle of the field that we've seen quite often in Philadelphia.
Luke Kuechly action.
Yeah, and we know that those the middle of the field, like Luke Kuechly, can really run with the ball. We've seen Carolina do it a lot. My bad bold call here, Jordy Nelson. I don't think a lot of people are talking about the Packers wide receivers as much as they're talking about Aaron Rodgers. A lot of people like them. I do not like Jordy Nelson this week. I think he goes under 10 DraftKings points.
There was no separation last week on them, so
I just don't think that he looks right yet. I mean, maybe he's still recovering, which could definitely happen. But yeah, I think he's going to be under 10 DraftKings points this week. So our bold calls. Jim killed my dreams with Phillip Rivers. He likes Kenny Britt for 100 yards and a touchdown. Adam likes Dwayne Allen as the number 1 receiver. But he doesn't like any of these new running backs other than Theo Riddick. My guy, I just mentioned, I like Carolina's defense for over 20 DraftKings points. I have them at 22 for defense. And Jordy Nelson goes under 10 points this week. So let's talk about what's going to happen to RotoCurve for the next few days. We have NFL football on Sunday, so be sure to go over to RotoCurve.com, check out all the tools. We have a premium cheat sheet for flex. We have a premium cheat sheet for everything. Everything combined, we have quarterbacks, individual cheat sheet, running backs, receivers, and tight ends. There's a members-only free roll this week, so be sure to get in on that. It's a great way to earn some money back. We have an optimizer for NFL lineups. You can see what our tools like for lineups this week, and you can even make your own on there. Consensus rankings, you can find everybody's ranks up there. Currently, Jason Ziernicki is leading with 106 points, so we have to catch up to him there. We even have a brand new thing this week. DFS Pro Brian Healy BJ19, who has 3 live finals, the last 3 live finals where he had 8 tickets, is posting his picks in the cheat sheet. So be sure to take advantage of that. The guy that has a ton of success in DFS, I'm going to be taking a look at those picks right after we get off on air. Adam has his cash and GPP picks this week. Of course, he discusses his favorite bargains as well. We know Jim has an excellent Rosters Market Watch where he discusses his favorite bargains, his favorite plays over at rosters.com. All of this stuff I just mentioned, under $1 a day. Does not get any better than that. What a bargain. This has been RotoCurve Live for Week 3, presented by Rosters.com. If you look below us, you can see the promo we can use for that if you haven't signed up. For Adam Pfeiffer, that's Jim McCormick. I'm Josh Kalachi. Good luck in Week 3. Let's hope Jim and Adam don't kill any more of my teams with off air. Good luck, everyone.